welcome to the virtual edition of our year-round screening series, Film Independent Presents. My name's Jen Wilson, and I'm a senior programmer here at Film Independent. Before we get started, I want to give some praise to our supporters. Thank you to our incredible lead sponsor, the Hollywood Forward Press Association, our screening partner, Vision Media, and our media partner, the Los Angeles Times. For those watching live, you can take advantage of our question box that's at the bottom of the screen. If you want to submit a question there for any of our guests today, I can ask those towards the end of the Q&A today. And today, I'm pleased to welcome our guests from the film Disclosure, director, producer Sam Fader, producer Amy Scholder, and executive producer and featured subject Laverne Cox. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
So because we have so many, we're a membership organization and we have so many members that are aspiring filmmakers, I like to start with all of our interviews subjects' origin stories on how you ended up in the film business. So do you want to start? You want to start with Sam?
Sure. Yeah, let's see. There's so many ways to answer that question. Let me just gather my thoughts real quickly. I think, when I was 15, I took a photography class for the first time. And it was around that same time. And mind you, that camera I used was the Pentax K1000. So for photo people, they know that is the most basic manual camera you can possibly get your hands on. And at the same time, that's when Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive. And one of my high school mentors was a huge Magic Johnson fan, and she began organizing us. And I became politicized through AIDS activism. And in response to seeing how media shaped stigma around HIV/AIDS, and how I was just really moved about how that influenced cultural norms. So I began telling stories through photographs about people living with AIDS, and specifically Black and brown HIV gay men who were adopting children who were born positive. And so I think that's when I really got hooked on the transformative potential of seeing yourself in ways you may want to exist in the world, as opposed to the way the media was telling you your options were. And a few years later, I started applying that to films about trans people that I was a community with and our social, cultural, political landscape. Yeah, that's kind of how I got into the business.
It's interesting to me how many filmmakers actually started out as photographers. I think Stanley Kubrick started out that way too.
Really? Yeah, he and I have a lot in common.
You do. Okay. Laverne, origin story?
Oh my, there's so many. I've been a performer my whole life. I started out as a dancer. I started training when I was in third grade, when I was about 8 years old. And so I've been performing my whole life, and I always knew I would transition to acting. I started acting in college. I did my first non-musical plays when I was at Marymount Manhattan College. And one day, actually in 1996, my senior year at Marymount, I was on the subway, and I remember I was wearing this paisley coat with a faux fur collar. It may have been real fur, it was vintage, I don't know. I think it was, I don't know. And I looked fabulous on the subway, and this woman sees me, and this is before my medical transition, and this woman sees me on the subway. She's like, "You'd be great for this film I'm involved in. Can I get your information?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And I went and auditioned for the movie, and I booked it. And that was my first film, was my senior year in Marymount. And I was a dance major at Marymount, and my degree is in dance, and I was acting, but I wasn't taking it fully seriously yet. It wasn't until many years later, and several films later, actually. I did maybe 3 or 4 more independent films, just auditioning and whatnot. And then in 2001 or 2, I think I found Susan Batson's studio in New York. And that's when I really got serious about acting. And yeah, and then after a while, I became clear that there weren't a lot of opportunities for Black transgender women in Hollywood, and so I knew I needed to produce as well. And so I started working with a friend of mine at the time, and we started pitching shows. They were reality at the time. That ended up being a reality show called transformed me after I was on another reality show called I Want to Work for Diddy. And yeah. Anyway, so the story goes on, but that's basically how it all started.
I actually programmed another doc you produced, Laverne, Free CC, at the LA Film Festival a few years ago.
Thank you so much.
Um,
I think I was there for that. Yes, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for your producing work in the doc sphere, especially. I really have enjoyed everything that you've been a producer on.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So Amy, what's your origin story?
Well, the short version is that I have a background, a career in independent book publishing, and got my start in the mid 80s at City Lights Books, and was very quickly realized that my role there and then in the independent publishing world was to amplify the voices of marginalized people, and in particular LGBTQ people and people of color, and in that work to publish books by David Wojnarowicz, or Sapphire's first book, or American Dreams, or June Jordan's Love Poems became kind of my calling to really amplify voices of people who were telling stories that weren't told in the mainstream. And fast forward many, many years later, I was taking a break from my book publishing career, encountered Sam's last film, Kate Bornstein as a Queer in Pleasant Danger, thought it was so beautiful. And when I learned that Sam was working on this new project, at that point, only an idea, still in research, I realized how important it was, how Sam was the right person to really be leading this kind of research and making this kind of film, and how aligned it was with the work that I've been doing my whole life. And Disclosure then became my first credit as a producer.
I'm a big fan of your Kate Bornstein doc as well. I was lucky enough to get to see it at the Red Cat when it was in Outfest, and it was incredible. Sam, do you want to talk about what's the overall origin story for this film? Was it something that you've been working on for a long time?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. A lot of ways it's something I've kind of been thinking about my entire life, you know, and then I think when I saw the Cellulite Closet and Ethnic Notions, right, that had a huge influence on me. Cellulite Closet is about the history of gay and lesbian representation in film, and Ethnic Notions is about the history of Black representation in film. And Ethnic Notions in particular is the history of America, right? It's just told through this very specific lens. And I was just really, I think both those films really changed my relationship to media. I used them as a teaching tool. I was teaching college at the time, and I saw how it, you know, both those films affected my students. And so I just was constantly thinking about what this history would look like for trans people. And then, you know, I was making films over the years, and then 2014, Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. And I think it was June 9th. And, you know, she was the first openly trans woman to be on the cover. It was a big deal. She wore this beautiful blue dress. I mean, it's burned into my brain. It's probably because it's framed in my house, but she wore a beautiful blue dress, and she's looking defiantly down at the camera, and the text on the cover read "The Transgender Tipping Point." And I felt so many things in this moment. On one hand, I was thrilled and excited because I had followed Laverne for many years in the New York activist scene. And, you know, she had a column at the Huffington Post. And so the idea that this woman would have this type of platform was thrilling, because I knew she would use it towards good, which we've witnessed. And at the same time, I was really concerned, right? Because when that cover story hit the newsstands, trans people had barely been acknowledged, I mean, let alone celebrated, right, in the mainstream media. And so I immediately thought about how when we look at history, whenever marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. So especially when all the public knows about trans people has been so distorted by the media, it made me wonder, how was this going to unfold for the community at large? you know, the community that I was surrounded by was still disproportionately underemployed, lacked access to safe housing and healthcare. And so I really felt there was more to the story than what the public was seeing. And so I wanted to explore that story.
Yeah, I've seen Celluloid Closet many times. It was a really important film in my life, and I think for a lot of other people too. But I remember when I was in grad school for film studies, one of my college professors in this lecture hall class that was a mix of film studies and production kids showed that film, and I was surprised at how many people hadn't seen it. And I was like, this is so important because these are the future filmmakers. These are the people who are gonna make our films, and they need to know this history too. Everybody does. And there was just so much, but I remember so much buzz among the students that hadn't seen it, and I was just so happy about that and so grateful that my teacher had given people the access to it. And it really just sort of stood out how important it is to have films like that and that people see them. And it made me think about this film and Netflix, and sort of what was your decision making around wanting to show it on Netflix?
Who would you like to address that? Who would you like to answer that?
Oh, anybody. Sam.
I mean, I think we were thrilled to have that opportunity, to have that platform. You know, it was a perfect match in the sense that, you know, it's been Laverne's home for many years. They love Laverne over there. And I think there's a room called the Laverne Room at the Los Angeles Netflix building.
I'm not sure about that.
No, there is actually the Laverne Cox Room. Maybe it's no, it is. I think it's the Laverne Cox Room.
There's an Orange is the New Black room. I don't think there's.
And then a very big image of you. So in my mind, anyway, my takeaway was they like Laverne.
It's the Laverne Cox Room.
Let's pretend. Let's rewrite that history. There is a Laverne Cox Room. Anyway, though, this is, it's so tricky. The industry is tricky. The business is tricky. We were very invested in having this film reach the community. We wanted to do festivals, and then having COVID cancel that out, we really understood that Netflix would give us the greatest reach and allow people who also during non-COVID times might not have access to festivals, might not be able to afford festivals. They could afford their monthly subscription more likely to Netflix. So as complicated as the landscape is, especially for independent filmmakers, of figuring out what the best platform is to get your work out there that matches up to your values and ethics, this really was the perfect match for this film. And so we were thrilled to be able to collaborate with them. And their team at Netflix has been incredible. I just can't, it never ceases to amaze me how supportive and smart and accessible they've been since our launch. Well, 3 weeks before our launch.
I would like to add though, how with the standing ovation at Sundance and critical acclaim and all the lovely things that have accompanied this film, it was very challenging selling this still, right? That like landing at Netflix was shared too. It was meant to be. But I think folks should know that with everything, all the progress that we've made, a lot of people still think trans stories are niche stories. A lot of people, net television networks think that they have their trans project and they don't need to have another one. So I think people should just be aware of that. Shout out to Netflix for all the love.
To echo that, we literally were told by some distributors that, literally this is a quote, "We already have a trans film that we bought 4 years ago. We don't want to oversaturate our market." That's what we were up against. It was rough for a couple of months. We didn't sell the film until I think May. Yeah. It was like less than 6 weeks before we premiered. When we finally finalized our deal. It was rough. But we're thrilled, and here we are.
Thank you for sticking it out.
Yeah.
I think that it's great that it's on Netflix, because you're talking in the movie about how so few people will actually have the chance to get to know a trans person in person right now, and Netflix is a place where I think a lot of people like troll around for stuff to watch, to bring them something new in their life that they haven't encountered before. And I feel like it's great if their first experience of transness in the media is this film. Was that something that you were thinking about when you made it? Like, what if this film would be an audience member's first encounter with this issue or their first exposure?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the driving forces was that we kept thinking about was, how do we address people's biases of telling the story? And as much as the overt messaging that we bring up, that I think really help people sort through their perceptions. We were very intentional about including so many voices to tell the story. I think there's 31 different trans people. And I think that ultimately has an even greater impact. Social scientists have pointed out that whatever is in the background of a story that we watch, that is actually what reprograms our brains, right? It's the wallpaper, it's the stuff that becomes an inherent expected part of the environment. Like that's what actually changes the way we see the world. So I do think seeing so many trans people tell this story does a part in moving the needle towards dismantling implicit bias. And I think that was definitely, front and center in constructing the film.
I loved the section of the film where Laverne talks about how much she loves Yentl, and how she didn't think she was the target market for that film. And I loved that part because so many times we encounter things and you're like, I don't think this was made for me, but I somehow love it. And I was wondering if Amy and Sam, you have that story, if there's any movie or television show that you have that story about, that it spoke to you, like a trans story in film or television.
Amy?
Sam's like, I'm still waiting.
God, that's a tough question. I don't have that.
I have two, and they're both French, actually. Mavi and Rose and Tomboy were the first two trans projects I saw that I was like, okay, I think they got it right. I think somebody got it right.
That's very, well, it's interesting you mentioned Mavi and Rose, because there's a scene where the little kid is getting their haircut by their mom to give them a kind of gender approach, like a little boy's haircut, and the kid is crying because it really goes against her own feelings of her gender. And I respond so viscerally to that scene, and Sam noticed it, because we were looking at this footage over and over and over again. And I remember, Sam, once you said to me, "Oh, this really gets to you, this scene," and it was because my mother used to cut my hair in a way that really didn't comport with how I felt I needed to look and present. And so I think in that way, there are these moments. I wouldn't say I had that kind of full identification with that character or that film, but there are scenes. I think that's why Hollywood is so powerful, is, these depictions are they get under your skin and they make you recall, these moments in your life that are so painful, and may not be exactly obvious that you're going to identify with those particular characters.
Sam, did you think of one, or are you gonna pass on that? Pass. Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass on that.
What I love about this film is how it talks about how problematic our history of trans representation in the media is. And some films totally got it wrong, some films got it half wrong, half right, but there was still some things that we liked about it, because if that feels like that's the reality of LGBTQ representation in films, in the beginning, people aren't going to get it right because the people who are living that are not actually the ones writing and directing and producing the product. I'm just wondering, so that in that way, this film is sort of, I love that you didn't leave things out, because we have this big conversation going on right now about cancel culture, and it's sort of, do we erase the things that misrepresented us, or do we bring them out in a film like this and really talk about it and talk about what the problem was with it? I'm wondering if you have an opinion. There's a big conversation about J.K. Rowling right now, being very vocally transphobic. And I think for me, as someone who was very much into the Harry Potter world, into the books, into the films, I feel like I can't support her work now. I'm wondering if you have any feelings about the difficulty of work of an artist and an artist. Yeah, thoughts.
So much came up for me as you were just talking now. And I think, Jen, the big thing for me around what you refer to as cancel culture is, Brene Brown says, if we deny our stories, those stories define us. And when we own our stories, we can write a brave new ending. So much of what the history of America is in terms of race, the history of America is until recently, in terms of transgender folks in our lives, is a history that we have not been able to own. And disclosure is an opportunity to own that history. And when we can own that history, we can write a brave new ending. We cannot write a new ending. We can't really make change if we don't tell the truth about the story. And so that for me is the piece. And I think at the end of the day, I'm so much more interested in focusing on what is positive and uplifting in the world, and not focusing on someone who I'm so much more interested in focusing on that. And I think for everyone has to make decisions about how they, if they're able to support an artist and then, disagree with them on some level. And what I love about our film is that I think we hold a lot of places of complicated positions around being able to hold contradictory, complex ideas at the same time. We love film, and I have such love for so many of the projects that we talk about in Disclosure that are deeply problematic, and a lot of these stories I know because these are shows I watched, and even as I saw problematic trans storylines, I continued to watch the show. And I watched critically, and I had so many times where I've just been like, this is really just, I hate this, and this is awful, and this is disparaging, but I love this show. And so how wonderful that we can do that, right? That we can be able to sort of say that something is wonderful and inspiring in so many ways, but then can have some problems. And so I think that is what we must do, because I think, I don't think human beings are disposable. I think canceling people suggests that people are disposable. And it also suggests that people are irredeemable and that they can't change. And so I'm really interested in being transformed and transforming culture. And we don't transform culture and change perspectives by assuming that people are irredeemable, and so we must dismiss them.
I think was it you, Laverne, that says in the film the thing about Ryan Murphy having produced both Nip Tuck and Pose, and just how that's such a great example of how somebody can change.
Yes, I did say that, absolutely. And Nip Tuck is a show that I watched voraciously. I loved that show. I was obsessed with Nip Tuck. And at the same time, I was like, ah, it was like, what is going on here? But I loved the show, and I watched, and how exciting that Pose exists. I mean, Pose is like groundbreaking on so many levels and so affirming of trans people, our stories, our humanity. Trans people are writing, producing, directing, doing the makeup, consulting, acting. I mean, it's fabulous. And so And how, for us, could you imagine? I don't know if anyone could cancel Ryan Murphy, but could you imagine, if we had just sort of dismissed him and he thought that, I don't want to try to tell these stories anymore. And what a horrible loss that would be to the world. I couldn't imagine the world without Pose right now. I couldn't even imagine it.
Since this had never been done before, we felt it was so essential that the film itself be an embodiment of the change that we do want to see in storytelling, and I think not only the narrative, but also the production model do that. And our insistence on the nuance that you're referring to, right? That people don't know what they don't know, that people, most people should get a second chance, that you can love something, but also be critical of it. There isn't just one way of seeing something. It's that kind of nuance that we believe and hope can be carried beyond the film.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah. I loved the archival in this film. I'm a huge silent film fan, and anytime I see any queerness in any silent film, it hits me in the feels really hard. Do you want to talk about how did you work with the historian, how you found which silent films you were going to focus on, and how found the footage?
Sure. I wish I had worked with a historian. When I started this film, the first thing I did was think about how Ethnic Notions and Celluloid Closet had been made, and they had both been based on a book. So I thought, great, let me find that book, and then that's what I will start on the history of trans representation. Alas, it did not exist. There was one tiny book called Transgender on Screen. I think it was written in 2006, and it was the only nice thing to say about it is that it was problematic, right? That would be like the nice spin. So the first 3 years were entirely focused on the research, curating and harnessing a mountain of archival footage. I spent the first 6 to 8 months, and this is when Amy came on board, traveling around the country and doing research interviews with trans people that I knew who had worked on one side of the camera or the other. And so that was the beginning of the history. That was the nexus of this history, because I understood that, documenting a history for the first time is really ethically precarious. And I did not want to do that in a vacuum. So I brought in as many trans voices and perspectives and memories, from beginning to end into that process, and shaping and structuring the narrative was absolutely a puzzle, and that was based on the personal anecdotes and the historic touchstones. Because progress is not linear, we really wanted to show how the past and present, folds in on itself.
I did my master's was on a silent era queer director, and it's hard unearthing our queer history from the silent. I mean, silent era research is fascinating but difficult because it's a real mystery. It's a detective story, right?
But there's so much there.
Yeah,
there's so much.
There really is, and I wish it was better funded area of study, because so much of our history is still there to be uncovered. And I remember when the end of Celluloid Closet, they used that footage of that old Edison film of the two guys dancing together. And I remember some critic or somebody comments about, like, why would they use that footage? Edison just shot that because he just needed two people to be in a film. It was like a test film. Or I was just like, why would you say something so stupid? Because people are going to watch films without that context and totally interpret that as a queer dancing scene. So
and similarly, one of the clips that we have in disclosure is of someone, George Cerrone, who was a female impersonator at the time, and he was doing these screen tests for Edison. And he's in a wig and a dress, and he actually kisses the man in the scene, and this is thought as like the first on-screen kiss, right? So all the layers in that. But I think, right, what you're saying, people aren't going to know like the context in which this film was made, but it also shows that our stories have always been there, right? And our stories wouldn't exist if we didn't exist. And I think that's like really important for marginalized people who don't see themselves to understand and to finally see.
And then how do we disidentify too? How do we, I mean, I think that the Yentl moment you alluded to earlier, I always love alluding to the late Jose Munoz's concept of disidentification. Everyone I think should read Jose's book. And to disidentify, I believe Jose defined it as when we, particularly as marginalized people, identify with cultural production that was not culturally coded for us to identify with. And he defines it as a specifically sort of queer LGBTQ plus phenomenon, and cites all these beautiful examples throughout the book. And one of the things I love most about Disclosure is and I've been saying this for a long time, is that it's about how we look as trans people. It's about trans spectatorship and a trans gaze, if you will. And sometimes that's a disidentifying gaze. And that is part of the history, I think, of film, is how it is viewed and how we see it. And it's how wonderful not only to document that history, but to foreground the spectatorship, the trans gaze, the ways in which we look at that history.
Okay, I'm gonna take some questions from our audience. Okay, this film is excellent. Were there any examples of positive representation that didn't make the final cut of the film?
Oh my
You're
God.
shaking your head, Laverne. What are you thinking of?
I'm saying yes. I'm like, God, I can't, there's just so much. I mean, I think there's so many things we didn't go into. We have clips from Supergirl, we have clips from Euphoria, we talk about Pose. I mean, we could have gone, there's so many details about that. We could talk more about, Asia Kate Dillon, we wanted to interview. Asia wasn't available. Asia is the brilliant actor, critically nominated, Critics' Choice, multiple nominated actor who from Billions, who is non-binary, the first openly non-binary character on television. God, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot. And so we couldn't, the film was all, at one point, I think the first rough cut I watched was 4 hours long. So, and yeah.
I think that gets longer every time you refer to it.
Was it not 4 hours?
I don't think it was ever 4 hours, but it seemed like 4 hours. But
I felt like it was 4 hours.
yeah.
I was like, Sam, this is
Judging.
long. I'm like, Sam, this is long. This feels like 4 hours. I love it. Our memory. See, that's the thing about memory, There's slippages, there's fluidity.
But between the three of you, sort of, who gets the task of deciding what stays in and what's most important to stay in?
I mean, ultimately, I am the director, and Amy and Laverne, I mean, we're incredibly respectful, but we collaborated really deeply on this, and I think we really relied on each other and really respected each other. And honestly, like we really are so like-minded in our values and our ethics, and we hit a lot of roadblocks in making this film because we believed in our process so deeply, and it was an unconventional process. And that sort of, that way of being, I think, influences our lens and how we're going to tell this story. So there was never a point where we struggled over something that one person wanted to include and something that someone didn't want to include.
I think
what I will say, Amy, go on.
Well, I just wanted to say that it helped that we established early on, and that Sam's vision, from the beginning, was that the story should really be told from the perspective of the interviews and the experiences and memories of the people who are interviewed, rather than a kind of survey or history of Hollywood. And by kind of sticking to that idea of the structure, that it had an emotional arc and that it was built around the trans creatives who are interviewed in the film, it really helped to make those final determinations, because it is always a case of, like, you kill your babies at the last minute, that we loved certain things that had to go, but I think it was because we stuck to this spine around what is the story that our interview subjects, our protagonists are telling, and how does that lead us to this current moment that we're in? I mean, I think one of the biggest, there's so many differences between Disclosure and Celluloid Closet or other films that are surveys of marginalized people. I think especially comparing Celluloid Closet and Disclosure is like, because the moment for the trans community is so different right now than it was like for gay and lesbian people in the mid 90s. I think we have to understand the urgency right now of understanding where stereotypes and stigma of trans people come from, so that we can begin to change. Like, if you don't understand these stereotypes, if you really, if you're not trans and you don't understand that you have these stereotypes, that trans people are stigmatized in this very, very specific way, then you really can't get like what the violence is and why the trans community faces so much violence. Violence on the street as well as legislative violence. So I think that, there was a sense of like telling a story of history that went into this film, but I think for us, the passion was around like, how can we deliver by the end of this film the kind of ingredients that audiences then will walk out of, will turn off their TV, whatever, their computer, and say, oh, okay, now I've seen it. I can't unsee it. I understand what it might feel like to have a trans experience of the world, of the way in which these depictions, are made over and over and over again, that are, either dehumanizing or inaccurate, or just relentlessly one or two or three things rather than a kind of multiplicity of depictions. And then we can kind of get on the other side, hopefully, of this moment in time when there is so much violence against trans people.
I think that what you say about wanting to achieve with this film is true, because the next question says, I really appreciate how this documentary creates a conversation. What do you hope people take away from this documentary? Sam?
I mean, I think because, like, kind of echoing what Amy was saying, because Disclosure, is an emotional ride, right? That takes you, into such points of nostalgia, and you're laughing and you're crying, and because it's based on these very intimate and personal anecdotes, which took years of trust building to arrive at. I think that leaves the viewer in a place that they, I don't know if safe is the right word, but they can kind of start to have the confidence to contend with their own assumptions about trans people and start to interrogate what those assumptions are and the roots of them.
This says, as a young trans man pursuing acting in college, this film made me incredibly emotional as part of my hope as a performer to provide the representation I never had as a kid. Do you have any advice for young trans actors or trans people hoping to work in this industry?
I'll answer that one. Oh God, hi. I love actors, and I love young trans people pursuing acting. Many years ago, I was giving a talk in Chicago. I think it was at Loyola, and I could be wrong. I was giving a talk in Chicago, and when the young man who introduced me was a trans student at the school, and after the talk, he walked me back to my hotel and was asking me sort of all these questions, sort of picked my brain, and he just was so. He was just wonderful. And so I sat down with him for like an hour and a half, and I was like, ask me anything. And I just sort of told him everything I knew about how many years it was, the 20 years that I struggled in New York, trying to make it in the business, and about survival jobs and everything. And a year and a half ago, I was at a Met Gala after party, and he was there, and he came up to me. He was like, "We met. You sat down with me. a couple of years ago. And he's like, now I'm working on Ryan Murphy's Politician, and I moved to LA and I'm an actor. And I was just like, oh my God, his name is Theo Germain. And I was just like, that's amazing. And one of the things I said to him, and I say to all actors, is that you have to, if there's anything else that you can do that you're passionate about, you should do it. Because being an actor is extremely difficult. There's so much rejection. You're told you're too tall, too short, too fat, too skinny. If there's something else you can do that you really love, you should do it. But if you love it and can't live without it, then pursue acting. The craft of it is extremely important. I think you must train. I think there's many different processes and techniques that you should avail yourselves of in theater as well as being on film. Learn the business as well as you learn the craft. It is a business. And then I think location, especially if you want to work in film and TV, you need to be in a city where that can happen. With self-tapes now, that's all shifted, but at the end of the day, once you get the job or you get a call back, you need to probably be in a location where you can make it happen. Learn the business, work on your craft, and never give up if it's something that you love. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you for supporting Theo Germain. I love Theo Germain.
Awesome.
He's in my friend Abby's show, Work in Progress, too.
Yes, I love that show. Can I just take a moment as well to give a shout out to Film Independent? I feel like we're talking about trans history, and Film Independent and with the Independent Spirit Awards made some beautiful trans history that we should acknowledge. The first trans person to be nominated for a major acting award was Harmony Santana in 2011. She was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award for Gun Hill Road, supporting actress in a film, and that was historic. It was major. A few years later, Maya Taylor made history as the first openly trans person to win a major acting award. And it's still, I believe, the only trans person to win a major acting award. And that happened because of Film Independent. And I'm so grateful to you guys for that history and for acknowledging us. Another thing I think is important to say then that we touch on in disclosure is that trans people have been telling trans stories for a really long time and receiving accolades for it, making money and profiting from our stories. Very rarely have trans people actually profited from our own stories. When we think about awards and on the Academy Awards, for example, 3 openly trans people have been nominated for Academy Awards in the entire history of the Academy Awards. No openly trans person has ever won an Oscar. So that is part of our history and something I encourage people to think about in the context of disclosure.
Thank you for saying that, Laverne.
Of course.
If I can speak on behalf of the Spirit Awards, I will say we love you too. Mwah. I think that's all the time that we have. We had a couple of people, I think we have a few minutes. We had a couple of people ask what the 3 of you are working on now. Do any of you want to talk about what you have coming up next, or is it all secretive?
It's not a secret for me. I have a film called Bad Hair that is currently streaming on Hulu.
Yay!
Written and directed by Justin Simien, the creator of Dear White People. It's a brilliant horror satire that people should check out if you haven't checked it out already. And I have another film that I'm acting in called Promising Young Woman that's premiering on Christmas Day. I'm not sure where yet. Written and directed by Emerald Fennell. It's her feature debut. She wrote and produced the 2nd season of Killing Eve. It's a brilliant film, sort of post-Me Too revenge story that I think is very, very important, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Promising Young Woman, everyone should check out. Christmas Day.
I was lucky enough to see that, and it's fantastic. And you're fantastic in it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
She is really good in it. I love that movie. And Amy and I are really, committed to and working so hard, around the clock on our impact campaign. The impact we want this film to have. We've already seen it, from starting a trans sensitivity training in the largest tech union in the world called IATSE. That happened after one of our first, interview shoots. The fact that we prioritized hiring trans people and we couldn't hire a trans person. We trained a trans person, and now our fellows have gone on to have great jobs in the industry. You know, we're continuing this work by being in conversations with the judicial system. You know, there was a group of California judges who used the film to educate one another about their biases when dealing with trans people in the court. The same side, lawyers are watching the film to prepare arguments to defend their clients. So we're really, you know, grabbing this moment right now and running with it as hard as we can to continue to deliver and work with our partners on the impact of the film. Right, Amy?
That's right, Sam. 24/7.
Yeah. And of course, you know, getting awards is thrilling, you know, on so many levels. But most of all, because it will bring attention to the crucial issues that trans people face, right? The more representation, the more people that know about us, the more people that meet the people in our film and start to feel a connection. And then they feel personally connected to the vital issues that the trans community is facing, you know, facing for survival, right? You know, a lot of people know that the trans women, specifically Black trans women, are facing an epidemic of murder. Like this has to stop. This is unbelievable. It's like, how do you even wrap your mind around this? This has been happening for years and it's getting worse all the time. And so, you know, how can, you know, the platform we have be used to continue to engage people in these conversations, on these life and death conversations, you know? So, you know, being in conversations around awards and having that visibility is an incredible opportunity. You know, I don't think there's ever been a documentary about trans people that has been a contender in the way this is, you know, let alone made by so many trans people. So we're very engaged in the distribution and the promotion of disclosure right now.
So in summation, the film's on Netflix. And also, I want to give another plug to your previous film, the Kay Bornstein film, because it's fabulous. Is it anywhere on the internet right now?
Yes, thank you. That means a lot. Thank you for saying that. It's on Canopy, and
Awesome.
I decided to stream it on Canopy because you can get it for free at public libraries,
Yes.
and a lot of schools have Canopy as well, so students can access it.
I love Canopy. They have such a great selection of films, and it's all free. You just need a library card. It's
You do.
one of the best things in the world.
I'm actually going to be moving Kate Bornstein and my previous film, Boy I Am, over to Frameline, just because I want to just kind of have that as a home for my previous work. So eventually you'll be able to find it there too.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today. It was so fun to talk to you all. It's such a great film, and good luck in your upcoming award season.